November 22nd, 1963, Palm Springs, California. Frank Sinatra is sitting in his compound when the news arrives from Dallas. John F. Kennedy, the man who had abandoned him, yes, the man who had chosen Bing Crosby's house over his, who had made him feel the specific humiliation of a friendship withdrawn without the courtesy of a direct conversation. That man, but also the man who had been his friend. The man who had represented something about American possibility that Sinatra had genuinely believed in. The young president whose inauguration Sinatra had produced with the pride of someone who had helped make history happen, dead. Shot in a motorcade in Dallas at 12:30 in the afternoon. Frank Sinatra went into his room and closed the door. He did not come out for 2 days. The people who were with him in those hours described something they had never seen before and would never see again. Frank Sinatra with nothing left to fight, the grief too complicated to process, the betrayal too recent to forget and too small, suddenly, to matter. A man who had faced every enemy available to him with absolute ferocity, confronting the one thing that ferocity cannot address, loss that arrives before the wounds from the previous loss have finished bleeding. This is episode 6, the darkest chapter, the decade that tried to make Frank Sinatra irrelevant, the kidnapping, the Beatles, the song that answered everything, and the retirement that didn't take. The 2 days that Frank Sinatra spent behind a closed door in his Palm Springs compound after the Kennedy assassination were not simply days of mourning. They were something more complicated and more difficult to name. He had loved Kennedy. He had also, in the 18 months since the Palm Springs betrayal, carried a wound that had not healed. The specific injury of a friend's withdrawal communicated through intermediaries and newspaper columns rather than a direct conversation. He had destroyed the helipad with a sledgehammer. He had not spoken to Kennedy again. He had not resolved anything. And now there was nothing to resolve. The man who had abandoned him was gone. The friendship that had been damaged was gone. The possibility of the conversation that never happened, the direct, honest accounting between two men who had genuinely cared for each other and had let politics and power and other people's calculations come between them, that possibility was gone with finality that no amount of time or forgiveness could reverse. The grief of losing someone you were in the middle of a conflict with carries a specific weight that ordinary grief does not. Ordinary grief has a direction. You miss the person. You mourn what you had. You grieve the future that will not happen. The grief of a damaged friendship ended by death has no direction. It moves in circles. It returns to the same questions that now have no answers and will never have answers and must simply be carried without resolution. Frank Sinatra came out of his room after 2 days. He resumed his life. He performed his concerts and recorded his records and maintained the public face of the chairman of the board with professional completeness. But those who knew him best described a quality in the months after Dallas that they struggled to articulate. A heaviness that had not been present before. A sense that something had shifted in the foundation of the man, not months, not visibly, not dramatically, but permanently. He sent flowers to the Kennedy family. He never spoke about it publicly. He had survived the war accusations and the record burnings and the voice hemorrhage and the Ava divorce and the Kennedy betrayal. Then someone took his son, and there was nothing the most powerful man in entertainment could do but wait. December 8th, 1963. Lake Tahoe, Nevada. Less than 3 weeks after Dallas. Frank Sinatra Jr., 19 years old, just beginning his own career as a singer, performing at Harrah's Club at Lake Tahoe, was taken at gunpoint from his hotel room by two men who had constructed a kidnapping scheme with the particular combination of boldness and incompetence that characterized the operation from beginning to end. The kidnappers called Frank Sinatra Sr. with their demand. $240,000, cash, delivered in paper bags. Sinatra paid. He paid without hesitation and without conditions. and without the kind of negotiation that law enforcement sometimes recommends in kidnapping situations. His son was 19 years old and had a gun pointed at him, and Frank Sinatra was not going to make strategic calculations about ransom negotiations while that was true. He assembled the money and delivered it. Frank Jr. was released unharmed after 3 days. The kidnappers were caught within a week. The FBI investigation was thorough, and the perpetrators were not sophisticated. They were convicted and sentenced. The legal resolution was clean, the psychological residue was not due. The experience had placed Frank Sinatra in a position that his entire life had been constructed to avoid: complete powerlessness. He was the king of Las Vegas. He had produced a presidential inauguration. His name opened every door in American entertainment and many doors in American politics. He had built himself from nothing to everything twice. And for 3 days in December 1963, none of it had meant anything. His son was in a room somewhere with a gun to his head, and Frank Sinatra, therefore, for all his power, for all his influence, for all the weight his name carried, could only wait by the phone and count out cash into paper bags. The people who saw him during those 3 days described a man they barely recognized. The ferocity that defined him, the absolute forward-moving certainty that had powered everything from the Hoboken roadhouses to the Sands Hotel, was simply absent. What remained was a father. Just a father, waiting. He never spoke publicly about those 3 days in any depth. Some things were not for public consumption, but those who knew him well said that after December 1963, he was never quite the same about the safety of the people he loved. A new vigilance, a new awareness of the specific vulnerability that fame and power cannot protect against. The year 1963 had taken Kennedy and nearly taken his son. Frank Sinatra moved into 1964 carrying both. He had rebuilt himself once from total destruction. Now the destruction was not personal, it was generational. And generational destruction is the one kind you cannot fight with a sledgehammer. February 9th, 1964. The Ed Sullivan Show. 4 young men from Liverpool, England, walked onto a stage in New York City and played their music in front of 73 million Americans. The response was the Paramount Theater of 1942 multiplied to a national scale. The screaming, the hysteria, the specific quality of a generation finding its sound and its identity simultaneously in a single broadcast. Frank Sinatra watched it happen and understood immediately what it meant. Not for him personally, since he was beyond the point where a competitor's success could threaten his commercial standing in any simple way. But for the world his music occupied, the world of sophisticated adult popular music, of swing arrangements and romantic ballads, and the specific emotional register that he had spent 30 years perfecting, and that now, almost overnight, was being repositioned by the culture as the sound of the previous generation. He said so publicly. He said it with characteristic directness and without the diplomatic softening that public relations advisors recommend when a prominent figure is about to generate controversy. He called the new rock and roll music the province of cretins. He said it was sung, played, and enjoyed by the illiterate and the unintelligent. He said things about the Beatles specifically that the Beatles fans receive with the enthusiasm of people being given a reason to intensify their devotion to the thing being attacked. He was wrong about the Beatles. He would eventually say so. Not with excessive grace, but he said it. The musical intelligence that had made him extraordinary in his own era was sufficient, given enough time, to recognize extraordinary musical intelligence in another form. But in 1964, he was not yet at the point of recognition. He was at the point of resistance. And the resistance was costly. It positioned him in the public conversation about American music as a man defending a territory that was being vacated by everyone under 40. He was not going to disappear gracefully. He was constitutionally incapable of graceful disappearance. He adapted with the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to abandon what they believe in while also refusing to be left behind entirely. They said he was finished. Again, he answered the way he always answered, by making something so honest and so powerful that the argument became impossible to sustain. The mid-1960s produced a Sinatra who was simultaneously adapting and resisting in ways that his career had not previously required. He recorded Something Stupid with his daughter Nancy in 1967, a gentle, sweet duet that reached #1 and demonstrated that he could still produce commercially dominant popular music when the material and the moment aligned. He recorded That's Life, a song of defiant resilience that carried in its lyric the exact quality of a man who has been knocked down repeatedly and keeps getting up, not because he has a strategy, but because staying down is simply not something he knows how to do. He continued performing. He continued recording. He made films that were uneven in quality but consistent in commercial ambition. He maintained the lifestyle of the chairman of the board with the same commitment to excess and magnificence that had always characterized it. The Palm Springs compound, the entourage, the private planes, the insistence on the absolute best of everything available. And in 1968, a French singer named Claude François recorded a song called Comme d'habitude. Paul Anka, the Canadian songwriter who had known Sinatra for years, heard it, bought the English language rights, and wrote new lyrics. He called the song My Way. He wrote it specifically for Sinatra. He wrote it as a statement of the life Sinatra had lived, the choices made without apology, the consequences accepted without complaint, the absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. He brought the lyrics to Sinatra, and Sinatra read them and recorded them in a single session on December 30th, 1968. He was 52 years old. The recording is not technically his most sophisticated vocal performance. His voice in 1968 was not the voice of the Capitol Records sessions. The years had taken some of the range, some of the effortless upper register that the Nelson Riddle arrangements had showcased so brilliantly. But what the voice had lost in technical perfection, it had gained in something more valuable, the specific authority of lived experience. When Frank Sinatra sang I Did It My Way, there was not a person alive who could reasonably argue that he was not telling the absolute truth. My Way became one of the most performed songs in the history of American popular music. It was played at funerals and at weddings. It was sung by presidents and by working men in bars on Friday nights. It was chosen by people at the end of their lives as the song that said what they wanted said about the life they had lived. It became an anthem not because it was perfect music, or it was not, but because it expressed with complete honesty and without sentimentality the conviction that a life lived on one's own terms with full acceptance of the consequences is a life worth having. Frank Sinatra did not know in December 1968 that he had just recorded the defining statement of his life. He finished the session, went home, and continued being Frank Sinatra. While he fought the public battles, the private ones continued in silence. They always do. The decade of the 1960s was not only the decade of the Beatles and the Kennedy assassination and his son's kidnapping, it was also the decade in which Frank Sinatra's personal life demonstrated once more the gap between what the public saw and what the man experienced. He married Mia Farrow in 1966. She was 21 years old, he was 50. The marriage attracted immediate and sustained public commentary. The age difference, the disparity in their public profiles, the question of what two people so differently positioned in their lives could possibly offer each other. Those who knew them described a genuine connection complicated by the impossibility of the circumstances. She wanted things that belonged to her generation. He wanted things that belonged to his. The gap between those two sets of wanting proved unbridgeable. They divorced in 1968. Through all of it, the marriages, the performances, the public battles, the private ones, Ava Gardner was in London. She had been there since the late 1950s, living in a flat in Kensington with a small circle of friends and a career that had declined from its 1950s peak but still occasionally produced work of real quality. She was not unhappy. Those who knew her in those years described a woman who had made a kind of peace with the choices her life had produced, who had enough of the things that mattered to her, who was not consumed by regret. But she was not well. The years of hard living, the drinking, the cigarettes, the relentless social pace of a life lived without much moderation were accumulating in ways that her health could not indefinitely absorb. And Sinatra, knowing this from the network of mutual friends that connected them across the Atlantic, continued doing the thing he had always done. He sent money. He sent it through intermediaries quietly, without making it a public gesture or using it as leverage for the reconciliation that was never going to happen. He sent it because she was Ava, and because there were obligations that divorce papers cannot dissolve, and that he had no interest in dissolving. He loved her. He had always loved her. He would love her for the rest of his life. Not in the active, present tense of a man pursuing a relationship, but in the permanent, irrevocable tense of a man for whom a certain person has become as much a part of his internal landscape as his own name. The money arrived in London regularly for 30 years. She never asked him to stop. He never considered stopping. He walked off the stage in 1971 and told the world he was finished. The world believed him. He did not. June 13th, 1971. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles. Frank Sinatra performed what he announced as his farewell concert. He was 55 years old. He had been performing professionally for 33 years. He had built himself twice, conquered music and film in Las Vegas and the White House, survived the Beatles and the assassination and the kidnapping and the marriages and the darkness of the decade that had tried to make him irrelevant. He walked onto the stage one last time and sang. The songs he chose for the farewell concert were not chosen randomly. They were a retrospective. The songs that had defined the eras of his life, arranged in an order that told the complete story of a career that had contained more reversals and recoveries than most men encounter in 3 lifetimes. He ended with My Way. Of course he ended with My Way. He walked off the stage. The audience rose. In the months that followed, the entertainment world adjusted to the idea of a world without Frank Sinatra performing in it. His records continued to sell. His films continued to air on television. The cultural presence of the chairman of the board did not diminish simply because he had announced his retirement. The weight of what he had produced over 33 years was not the kind of thing that fades in a season. But he was not performing. He was not recording. He was at the Palm Springs compound, hunting and spending time with friends and doing the things that men do when they have decided that the active portion of their lives has concluded and the reflective portion has begun. For 2 years, the silence held. And then it didn't. Because Frank Sinatra was not a reflective man by nature. He was a performing man. A man whose identity was bound up in the act of standing in front of an audience and singing, in the specific electricity of the moment before the first note, in the relationship between the voice and the room that had been the organizing principle of his life since Hoboken. Without performing, he was not diminished. He was simply somewhere he did not belong. In 1973, he released an album called Old Blue Eyes Is Back. The title said everything that needed to be said. He was back. The retirement had lasted 2 years. The silence had lasted exactly as long as it needed to last and not a moment longer. Frank Sinatra had looked at what a life without performing felt like and had made the only rational decision available to a man of his nature. He was going back. Not to recapture what the previous decades had been, not to pretend that the voice of 1973 was the voice of 1955, or that the cultural landscape of the early 1970s was the landscape of the Copa Room at its peak. He was going back because this was what he was, and the decade of the Beatles and the Kennedy assassination and his son in a room with a gun to his head and Ava in London with his money arriving quietly and My Way recorded in a single session on New Year's Eve. All of it had not changed what he fundamentally was, a singer from Hoboken who did it his way. The final chapter was beginning, and it would last longer than anyone expected, produce more than anyone predicted, and end the way Frank Sinatra's story was always going to end, not with a quiet fade, but with a voice singing until the voice could sing no more, and with a ring in his pocket that belonged to someone else. Next episode, the final chapter. The tours into his 70s, the voice that frayed at the edges and became more honest in the fraying, the death of Ava Gardner and what it did to him, the last performance, the last words, and the thing they found in his pocket when he died.